So certain people will tell you that science and faith, science and religion, science and Christianity are in competition. You have to choose one. You either believe in science or you believe in faith, and it's a war and you got to pick a side. Oh, I'm getting signals from the back. So I was going to look at that. Is science the enemy? Right? So as you guys are Christians in the school, is like science something you should avoid? Is science something maybe you shouldn't study? Maybe you shouldn't think about as a career? So I'm going to go through that. So I'm somebody who uses a lot of faith and science all the time, and I think they go together just fine. And so I'll try to explain that. So, next slide, please. Thank you. So as you go through the day, you have a lot of decisions to make. Right? What time are you going to get out of bed in the morning? What will you eat for breakfast? Some of the questions, so those decisions are a little more consequential. Like what career are you going to choose? And then if you're somebody like me who takes care of other people, some of my decisions, if I'm wrong, really bad things can happen to other people. So as I move through my day, I want to have as much knowledge as I can, so I'm making good decisions. In short, I'm seeking to understand life, the universe, and everything. Because if I can understand life, the universe, and everything, then hopefully when things go wrong, I know how to fix them. And I'm not just doing things at random and hoping they turn out okay. I find that both faith and science help me understand life, the universe, and everything. So let's start with science. So I brought some tools with me and a ball. So how did science come about? Certainly if you listen to some people, they suggest that science was invented by people who abandoned religion. Right? Religion kept us in the dark for centuries, and then these very intelligent people came along, they created science, and the world got better. And that's totally not correct. Science was actually invented by Christians, because for a long time, people thought that there were spirits in the plants and in the trees, and what you needed to do was keep those spirits happy, because if spirits weren't happy, bad things happened to you, plagues and that sort of thing. And then Christians came along and said, well, actually, God's a good God, and he's a predictable God, and he behaves the same way yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and he behaves the same way in one part of the planet as he does in another. Somebody thought, well, maybe since nature was made by God, it's the same way. It's predictable. And what happens now is going to happen the same later. And one of those guys, Isaac Newton, started throwing around objects, and he would throw them up in the air and watch them fall. And now he didn't have a baseball, right? This is like 300 years ago. But he watched things fall down. And of course, the famous thing he watched fall down was an apple. And it didn't really bonk him on the head. I don't know if any of you have seen Isaac Newton under the apple tree and it falls on his head. And he discovers gravity. What he was doing is he was throwing things up in the air, watching them fall and saying, that's interesting. When I throw it up in the air, it seems to fall exactly the same way every single time. And he kept doing that. And then he would go to a different room in his house and throw it up in the air, and it would fall exactly the same way. He's probably a better catch than me. And then he started studying that, right? So he measured how fast does it fall, and how fast does it accelerate when it falls. And maybe I can start trying to understand how that works. Right? And he came up with an understanding called gravity. He said, well, I think what happens is when you throw things in the air, they fall to the earth. Because the earth's a lot bigger, so it attracts things down. And then he said maybe the planets like go around the sun because they're attracted to the sun. And maybe the sun is in, and he gets this big model about gravity, right? And it's a fairly simple understanding. You start by throwing a ball around and you end up putting a man on the moon. Next slide. So his understanding of gravity 300-400 years later allows people that invent rockets to put people on the moon. And they were just using his formulas, his math. Science puts people on the moon, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. Of course, I'm not a rocket scientist. I don't throw balls around except for fun, and I've never built a rocket and launched it. What I do is I take care of women, and particularly women having babies. So I gotta work a cute baby into every presentation, of course. So there's a cute baby, aww. So many things can go wrong when you're pregnant. And when those things go wrong, I need to do something to fix that. And I rely pretty heavily on science to tell me what's going on and what the right thing to do is to fix it. So for example, one of the things that can go wrong when you're pregnant is as you deliver, you can have a lot of bleeding. These are bags of blood. Not cute baby's a little better, but you know, gotta have a little bit of blood in every presentation too. You like the baby better? Okay, apparently we go back to the baby. Historically, women would bleed a lot when they delivered sometimes, and some doctors discovered that if you put somebody else's blood into her, one of two things would happen. It would make sense, she's missing blood, put more blood in her. So they would do that, and sometimes it was miraculous. She would feel better, she'd walk away, she'd live instead of dying. And sometimes it didn't go so well. she would get swollen and have a rash and have excruciating pain, and then she would die. And nobody could figure out exactly why one of these two things happened, and so it became a bit of a gamble. When somebody was sick enough, you would think, should we try giving her blood? It might work. It might kill her in a more painful way. And then thankfully, somebody came along and said, well, maybe we should observe a little bit better what's in blood. And what they found was that some of the cells in your blood have certain markers on them, blood types, which you've all probably heard of. And they said, I wonder if the problem is we're giving people blood that their body wants to attack. So I wonder what happened if we only give people blood that matches their type. Right? Developed a theory, did an experiment, and it worked. And now nobody dies because they got the wrong type of blood. And every now and again, I give a woman blood and she lives instead of dying. Yay. And yay, yes, it's good. The cute baby happens and we get there through the blood slide. Science is helping me out. It's helping me relieve suffering, which is what God's called me to do. It works well in my life, which leads to the obvious question, why is there conflict? So I don't have any dispute with science. Indeed, I don't know how you can have a dispute with science. Science is a way of exploring the world. It's a tool. It's a method of thinking. It's a little bit like saying to the telescope, I don't believe in telescopes. I disagree with telescopes. I'm morally opposed to telescopes. A telescope simply is. You look through it and it lets you see the universe better. It's a little bit like the carpenter saying, well, I'm into carpentry, but levels I'm just morally opposed to. I'm against levels. There you go. It's just a tool. It's just assisting you in your task. And of course, the tool that I brought along, that I use, is a stethoscope, right? Science is just a way of exploring the world. But you will discover that there are those who believe that science is the only way to explore the world. And the term for that is naturalism. So let me introduce you to that big word. So naturalism refers to a way of seeing the world that believes that the physical world is all there is. Nothing more. Nothing else exists. There's nothing else there. There's only atoms and chemicals and forces and laws of nature. And if it can't be explained with atoms and chemicals and forces of nature, it simply doesn't exist. All of you don't actually exist. You're just collections of matter, randomly moving about. And follow of naturalism say that there's nothing outside of nature, so there's nothing supernatural, right? There can't be anything more than what there simply is. So most of you have probably never heard of naturalism, but you've probably heard of atheism, right? Some of your friends actually probably say that they are atheists. So atheism is there is no God. Of course, there's nothing outside of nature, then there isn't a God. That's one of the things that can't be there. So everybody who's into naturalism is an atheist. But not everybody who's an atheist is into naturalism, right? Because if you believe there's something outside of nature that's not God, then you could be a naturalist without being an atheist. And the term comes from theism. So in the history of people thinking, they tend to fall into two camps. There's the naturalists, who say there's nothing outside of nature, and the theists, who say there is something. And there's huge disagreements about what that something is. But of course, some people came along and said that they are atheist. They don't believe that there's anything outside of that. So Christianity has never been at war with science. Science was invented by us, and through most of history, the great thinkers and great scientists have been Christians. And at the moment, can find you lots of great scientists who are Christians and Muslims and Jewish and Buddhists and all sorts of faith. Faith doesn't seem to conflict with their doing science at all. But you'll find that it's the naturalist people that have an issue with Christianity, and Christianity also would have an issue with that. Now, there's a lot of complex philosophical reasons for that. I'm going to give you 3, and I'm going to try to make them really simple and move quickly. So the first problem, of course, is that science can't prove that naturalism is correct, or that faith is incorrect, right? So the naturalist says to you, there is nothing beyond nature. If I can't put it in a test tube and experiment on it, it doesn't exist. So then you can say back, well, have you ever put the claim that there is nothing beyond nature in a test tube? No, you can't do that. That's a truth statement that can't be subjected to the experimental method. There's no experiment you can go and do that proves that there is nothing beyond nature. So the only thing that they believe can find truth is science, and then they make a statement that you can't prove is true using science. Which is a little bit like the person in the telescope saying that there is nothing in the universe except what I can see through the telescope. And you say, oh, can you prove to me that that's the case? And they say, well, I'm not sure how I use a telescope to prove to you there's nothing in the universe except what's in the telescope, but I still believe it's true. And of course, it self-defeats. Second problem. Naturalism doesn't explain most of your experienced reality. So it's kind of convenient to get rid of God, right? It's kind of nice to say that we can do whatever we want, whenever we want, and we don't have to worry about anybody else caring about us or having anything to say. And that's kind of where naturalism came from. A couple hundred years after science gets going, some guys come along and say, you know what? We don't really need God. It's really not nice to have him around. Let's just say he doesn't exist. Poof, he disappears in a puff of human logic. The problem is, if you're into naturalism, a whole bunch of other stuff disappears. For example, beauty, right? Because beauty cannot be subjected to experimentation. You can't explain beauty in terms of forces. It disappears. Love disappears, right? Can you subject love to experimentation? And I picked my ties out very carefully, and I've got a wonderful tie tonight of Winnie the Pooh and Piglet, and they seem to be sharing a happy friendship moment. Friendship doesn't exist if you're a naturalist, because that's got to do with connections between people. And of course, people don't really exist. At least they don't have any free will, right? Because if I'm a naturalist, I believe that Zach is simply a collection of atoms, and his brain is just a collection of chemicals. And if I could figure out all of the atoms in his body and all the chemicals in his brain, I could predict exactly what he's going to do or say or think next, right? Because he is no more than the sum of the physical parts of him. And so he doesn't actually have a free will. He thinks he has a free will. He's deluded into thinking he's making choices. But he isn't actually making any choices at all. He's just a collection of atoms reacting to other atoms. And free will disappears. So this is part of the problem, right? So the naturalist comes along and says all of these things that all of you are pretty sure exist, like your free will, like love and beauty and friendship, doesn't actually exist, right? And if somebody comes along and tells you that all these things you pretty much know exist, don't exist, the first thing, of course, you're going to ask is, really? And what proof do you have of that? And then we go back to the original slide, which is, well, because there's nothing, and then how do you prove that? And it all falls apart. The other thing that, of course, won't exist is morality, right? Because if we're just physical atoms, is it bad or good that an asteroid collides into the moon? It's bad? I don't know, it might be good. It might make a pretty show in the sky, right? Beauty, there we go. But it simply is. It's just physical bodies colliding with each other. So if one human being kills another human being, is it bad or good? Well, that means that there's some sort of moral standard, which either we've just made up, in which case it's no more than about us, or exists outside of us and outside of nature, which of course can't happen if you're into naturalism. And the final problem I have, of course, is, as I said at the beginning, as I go and explore the universe and gain knowledge, I'm trying to make choices. I'm trying to make good choices. Naturalism can't guide choices, right? So if the question is, should I work to save other people's lives? Naturalism can't tell me whether I should or shouldn't.
Don't they choose to be a naturalism?
So, yeah, someone would choose naturalism. Yes, you would say, I choose to believe that there is no God. And you can get into very complicated arguments for and against.
But if they choose to be a naturalist, then they've disproved their theory right there by choosing.
Well, one of the things you can say is, so I've chosen to be something different, is that good or bad, right? And if they say, well, it's bad to choose something different, you say, on what grounds? And why are we even having this conversation? Because neither of us actually has any free will anyways, right? So my collection of random atoms and the chemicals in my brain have caused me to believe one thing, and the chemicals in your brain have caused you to believe another thing, and there's no morality. There you go. Pick your hockey team and go for it. It can't guide any of my choices. What's good, what's bad? It can't tell me. All it can tell me is how things behave. All it can tell me is how objects collide, bodies work, and that sort of thing. And I tried to make it fairly straightforward, but I probably didn't succeed all that well, which is why I set aside more time for question and answer than I did for talking. Questions and answers, things that people have thrown at you in science class that you're having trouble with, or conversations with your friends where you walked away and thought, I'm having a hard time figuring that out. So if God created us, who created God? So this is one of the things that the naturalist atheist will throw at you, right? Well, where did God come from? And of course, lots of complicated answers. The one that I like is that I am too small to figure that out. So one of the
Height
things...
has nothing to do with it.
There you go. No, height has nothing to do with it. My brain is too small to figure that out. And of course, they would throw back to you, well, see, that's obviously inadequate. And so what you could respond is, well, how do you know that God doesn't exist, right? And they will say, well, because I can't put him in a test tube. Well, how do you know that things you can't put in a test tube aren't real? Well, I just know that. Well, have you ever put that in a test tube and tested it? Well, then they can't. Right? What I do know is that as I study history and study scripture, there's lots of prophecies, and there is this person, Jesus Christ, who existed historically, and we know he existed historically, and he made a bunch of claims, and I can test all of those claims, and when I test those claims, they turn out to be true. And those claims lead me to think that maybe there is a God. And then experientially, I have interactions with him. So I can say to that person, well, it's partly my reason, as I've thought about it, it's clear to me that God exists, partly my experience that he exists. And once you accept he exists and figure out who he is, then you can ask him questions like, where did you come from? And the answer we get in scripture is, I was before you were, and that's as much as I can explain. Where you can get a tie like this? I got this at the Disney store.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Is
So,
it made of atoms?
is it which?
Made of atoms.
It is made of atoms. Yes. And of course, if you enter naturalism, the tie has no more moral significance than any of us.
That's depressing.
It is pretty depressing. Naturalism is a pretty nihilistic, so here's another big word for you, nihilistic, meaning nothing really matters, way of seeing the universe. Right? Because if the naturalists are true, there's no good or evil, then what you should do with your life is have as much pleasure as possible, and when you're done having pleasure, take yourself out in a rather painless manner. Right? Because there's nothing beyond this. There's nothing to work towards. There's no God to judge how you behave. So do whatever you want. And of course, when you apply that to living your life, it doesn't turn out so well. So that's politics and not philosophy. But I'll get into the philosophy a little bit. So science assumes in its functioning that there isn't anything beyond nature. Right? So they're methodologically naturalists. They assume there's nothing more. And so if you assume that there's nothing more, then evolution has to be how we came about. Right? So if there's no God, and you go out into nature and look around and see what's happening, so you go into nature, you look around, and you see that bacteria in hospitals keep finding ways to survive despite us giving them antibiotics. It's most annoying that they are very clever little things, and they keep changing, and then we give a new antibiotic and they change again, which is evolution on a small scale, right? Bugs are able to change. Darwin goes and he observes that moths were white, and then the Industrial Revolution happens and the trees went black, and the moths go black. There's change. So if the only way anything happens is by natural processes, obviously these changes made everything happen. It's the only alternative. It's the only explanation possible. And so in science, you will get people saying that that's the only thing if they've accepted that science is the only way of knowing. It's a little bit like how when you're in astronomy class, they never talk about biology, right? Because you're in astronomy class. And astronomers think that the only tool to use is a telescope. And they couldn't care less about stuff you discover without a telescope. So it sort of does make sense that in science class, you only ever talk about the conclusions that you reach in the methods that you use in science. A little bit like being in carpentry class and asking to talk about electricity. Right? The carpenter will say, I know that I should avoid wires with my hammer, and that's as much as I know about electricity. I think part of it is that science is coming at the world from a certain viewpoint, and that's why you tend to only get that. I can tell you that there are certainly lots of Christian scientists who believe quite strongly in creation science. But to believe in creation science, you have to accept that there's something beyond nature. Right? And for some people who are into naturalism and confuse that with science, that's unacceptable. Right? It's a little bit like agreeing to play hockey and showing up in football equipment. Right? That's not how the rules are played. Yeah. Could God have used evolution to create? Yeah. Certainly, as you get beyond, so this is a very basic debate, right? This is God exists or God does not exist. So you will find that theists, those that believe God exists, then get into other debates. Well, what's God like? What? He, she, it, they, thing. And one of the things you can get into is, well, to what degree did God create? Did he directly create? Did he indirectly create? And that is a debate for another night. That's a huge, huge topic.
Yeah, but it would still be completely God's creation. God still created the universe.
Yeah. So if God was in charge of the process, he's in charge of the process no matter how the process carries out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And these debates continue all the time. So certainly another thought that you can throw out there, nobody disagrees that physical forces are happening and that evolution occurs on a small scale. The naturalist would say there's nothing more. The theist would say there is something more driving that process. And that's the core of the debate.